Former President Barack Obama stepped out of the black SUV and paused for a moment beneath the grand stone archway of Buckingham Palace. His dark suit fit him perfectly, and the soft click of his polished shoes echoed against the courtyard's cobblestones. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses from the gardens beyond the palace walls. Though he had visited many places in his life, this visit felt different. It was a private, off-the-record meeting, arranged quietly by Palisades, who wanted to offer a simple human connection rather than a grand ceremony. He straightened his tie and took a slow breath, reminding himself of the reasons he had accepted this invitation. He had left the presidency with a promise to continue listening to people everywhere. Now, years later, he was here to speak honestly, with members of the royal household, learn their stories, and share a moment that stepped outside politics and protocol. His heart felt light with anticipation and just a touch of nerves, like a student about to meet a favorite teacher, as he paused. A small group of Palisades and security officers fell into step around him, their expressions respectful and calm. One aide handed him a folded note with a simple greeting from the Lord Chamberlain. Obama smiled and tucked the note into his jacket pocket. He wished he could thank the notary in person, but he knew that even this private meeting followed rules he would not see. That was part of the gentle mystery of the palace, so much tradition hidden behind closed doors. He continued forward, walking slowly across the courtyard. The walls on either side rose high, all light-colored stone and arched windows, each frame trimmed with white. The palace's many balconies looked down like watchful eyes, each one polished and still. Flags fluttered above, but he did not focus on them. His mind drifted back to other places he had walked, town squares in small American towns, school auditoriums filled with cheering crowds, humble front porches where ordinary people had welcomed him. Here, in this royal courtyard, he felt the same quiet hope he had often sensed in those simpler settings. A few steps farther, the row of royal guards came into view. They stood motionless, dressed in crisp red tunics and tall bearskin hats that rose nearly a foot above their heads. Their faces showed no reaction, their eyes staring straight ahead. Obama remembered how those tall hats had once struck him as almost comical, and how a child had once tugged at his hand and asked, "Do they ever blink?" But now, under the gray London sky, the sight felt solemn, almost ceremonial in its stillness. The palace staff had warned him not to stand too close or to speak unless spoken to. Yet he held his breath and stepped forward, ready for whatever might happen. One of the Palisades with him gave a slight nod. The silent signal meant that the formal part of his visit would begin. The aide whispered something quick into a radio and then stepped back. Obama gave a polite nod to the nearest guard. As usual, the guard did not move his head or smile. His posture remained perfect, as if carved from marble. Obama waited for a moment, curious about what the guard would do next. In that second of calm, the only sounds were distant church bells and the soft shuffle of a pigeon's wings overhead. Then, as if breaking a spell, one guard tilted his head slightly. He seemed to decide that the rules could bend for a moment. The other guards around him remained stone-faced. The world paused, waiting. Obama cleared his throat quietly. He wanted to say something simple, perhaps a polite good afternoon, but something held him back. Maybe it was the weight of all. The history around him, or the quiet hum of tradition that filled the air. He simply stood there, his hands loosely at his sides, eyes resting on the guard's uniform bright red, buttons gleaming like tiny mirrors, boots shining dark and perfect. Then the guard spoke, his voice low so only Obama could hear. "Sir," he said, using the familiar word, but with no hint of ceremony, "my grandmother voted for you 3 times. The guard's words were plain, almost shy. They did not hang in the air like an announcement. Instead, they landed softly, like a feather drifting down. Obama's heart leaped in his chest, felt a sudden warmth spread through him, and at the same time, a surprising ache of emotion. He was no longer just a former president meeting royal staff. He was a man being remembered by someone else's family story. The thought that an older woman he had never met had trusted him, had believed in him enough to mark her ballot in his favor 3 separate times, it felt deeply personal. For a moment, the walls of the palace courtyard faded away. Obama closed his eyes, and let himself imagine that grandmother. He pictured her in a modest living room, perhaps in a village far from here. Maybe she sat by a window, watching the world change with each election, clutching her ballot with the quiet certainty that her vote mattered. Maybe she whispered his name when she cast her vote. He thought of the weight of her hopes, her dreams for herself, for her grandchildren, for a future she might never fully live to see. The palace guard waited, respectful and still. Obama opened his eyes and looked at him again. The guard's face was unreadable under the tall bearskin hat, but his eyes held a quiet pride. In that glance, Obama sensed a lifetime of unspoken stories of family gatherings, of holidays, of everyday struggles, and how, somewhere in all of that, his own work had become part of her story. He took a slow breath and let it out. He wished he could kneel down and thank her in person to tell her how much her faith meant, but all he could do was smile and nod. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with feeling. He paused, then spoke again. "Please tell her I'm honored." The words felt small, but they carried all the respect he felt inside. The guard straightened. The moment passing as quickly as it had come. He snapped back into the perfect posture expected of him. The red tunic, the tall bearskin, the stiff, black boots, everything went back to its carefully maintained order. The air seemed to shift, and Obama realized that aides were waiting to guide him into the palace. The spell of the moment had broken, but inside him, the moment would never fade. As he walked away, his steps felt lighter. He thought about the countless people he had met during his presidency's schoolchildren, waving small flags. Farmers in fields, families in modest homes, and how each one had carried their own stories. He thought about how easy it is, in the rush of politics and headlines, to forget those personal moments. Yet here in a royal courtyard, thousands of miles from home, a guard's simple confession had reminded him of why he had done that work in the first place. He straightened his shoulders and kept walking, his gaze raised toward the palace doors. He felt a new sense of calm, as if the weight of his past burdens had lifted. The palace walls no longer seemed so distant or imposing. Instead, they felt like the setting for a single, unforgettable human story. And he carried that story with him as he moved deeper into Buckingham Palace, ready to listen, to share, and to remember what truly matters. Barack Obama stood very still after the royal guard spoke. For a moment, the world felt quieter. The palace courtyard, with its high walls and proud flags, seemed far away. All Obama could hear was that one sentence, "My grandmother voted for you 3 times." He tilted his head slightly and looked at the guard more closely. Under the tall bearskin hat, the guard's eyes held a gentle warmth. It surprised Obama how sincere the guard sounded. There was no teasing, no show, just a quiet man, sharing something that mattered deeply to him. Obama cleared his throat softly. He thought about how powerful that small moment was. Remember giving speeches in crowded halls, waving to cheering crowds, speaking about unity and hope. But here, face to face with a single guard, he felt how real it could be when one person shared a private truth. He wondered what had made the guard speak up. Was it the quiet of the courtyard? The gentle autumn breeze that carried the scent of roses? Or did he simply trust Obama enough to share something personal? The guard's uniform was perfect. The red coat sparkled in the soft light. The black boots shone as if they had just been polished, but beneath the polished surface was a man with a family, with memories and feelings. Obama imagined the guard's grandmother, pictured her at a small wooden table in her cozy home. Perhaps her house had lace curtains on the windows. Maybe she sat beside a vase of fresh flowers from her garden. He thought of her carefully filling out her ballot 3 times. Making a decision, she felt proud of each time. Obama took a breath and spoke quietly. "That means a lot to me," he said, his voice gentle. "I wish I could thank her in person." The guard nodded slightly, still keeping his posture straight. But his shoulders looked just a bit more relaxed. Obama smiled. "Please tell her I'm honored," he added.
Yeah.
He could feel his own voice tremble with emotion. He did not want to show too much, but he could not hide the warmth in his heart. At that moment, another palisade approached. She cleared her throat, reminding Obama that he was still in a formal setting. He offered a quick nod to the guard, and then followed the aide through a side doorway into the palace. As they walked, Obama turned back once to glance at the courtyard. The guard remained at attention, his gaze forward, his breath steady. But Obama sensed a kindness there that went beyond protocol, carried that feeling with him as he moved into the grand hall. Inside, the palace was calm but alive. Soft carpets, muffled footsteps, oil paintings watched from the walls. Rich tapestries told ancient stories. Obama walked slowly, letting the grandeur sink in. But even as he passed through opulent rooms, he felt the guard's words echo in his mind. He thought about all the years he had served as president. He remembered the tough times, the harsh criticism, the long nights going over policy details, the weight of decisions that affected millions. He remembered his family's support, too, the private moments of joy and fear when he wondered if he had done enough. Now, in this palace built centuries ago, he found a fresh reminder of why he had done that work. It was not just about laws or speeches. It was about people. It was about one woman in a small town who believed in a future she could barely imagine. It was about a guard in a uniform who carried her memory with him every day. It was about the power of small, sincere acts. Obama realized he often spoke of hope, but here was living proof of that hope in simple human connection. The aide led him into a smaller room with high windows. Light fell softly on a round table in the center. Cushioned chairs waited around. Two teacups sat on saucers, steam rising gently. Obama took a seat, smoothing his suit jacket. He felt more relaxed now, as if he could finally breathe again. He looked at the teacups and thought of sharing tea with friends back home. He remembered sipping tea with British families during past visits, listening to their stories, laughing at small jokes. Now he had a new story to share. The palace staff offered him tea and biscuits. He accepted a cup and took a small bite of a sweet shortbread. The taste was comforting, like home. He took another sip of tea and let the warmth spread through him. As he sat there, he thought about how many stories like this one existed in the world. He thought about people he had met in rural villages and crowded cities and universities. In living rooms, each person had their own story, their own reasons for hope or worry. He remembered a young student in Kenya who had written him a letter, saying that seeing him as president made her believe she could do anything. He remembered a veteran in New York who thanked him for healthcare changes. He remembered a teacher in Chicago who said his words had inspired her to stay in the classroom. All those memories felt connected to this quiet moment in the palace. He understood that leadership was not just about big speeches or major events. It was about listening and learning and honoring people's stories. He thought of the guard's grandmother again. He wondered about her life, her childhood, her work, her laughter, her tears. He wondered how many times she had told stories to her grandchildren, how her vote for him had become part of their family legacy. The aide waited politely as Obama finished his tea. He set the cup on the saucer and smiled. "Thank you," he said to her. "This is lovely." She nodded and asked if he was ready to continue. I stood and stretched, feeling refreshed. As he followed her through another doorway, he carried the warmth of that moment with him. He felt lighter, more grounded. He knew that, even after leaving the presidency, he could still find connection in unexpected places. They entered a long gallery lined with portraits of past monarchs. Some faces were stern, some gentle, some proud. All had stories behind them. Obama walked slowly, letting his eyes rest on each painting. He felt a sense of continuity, how people from different times and places could be linked through memories and actions. He thought about his own place in history. He wondered how future generations would see his work. He hoped that, like the guard's grandmother, they would remember his efforts with kindness and hope. At the end of the gallery, I paused by a window overlooking the palace gardens. The rose bushes were in full bloom, red and pink petals glowing. In the late afternoon light, you could see gardeners at work in the distance. A pair of swans glided gracefully on a fountain pool. The scene was peaceful, almost magical. Obama let himself absorb the beauty, thought about how beauty and kindness often appeared in small moments. He thought about how one sentence from a guard could touch him so deeply. He took a deep breath and turned away from the window. The aide gestured for him to follow. He stepped forward with a smile, ready for the next part of his visit. But inside, he held that moment like a precious stone. He knew that the guard's simple words would stay with him for a long time. They reminded him that every person's story mattered, every act of faith was powerful, and every small kindness could change a life. As he walked through the palace corridors, he felt grateful for the unexpected gift of connection, and he carried it with him into every conversation that followed. He walked through the next room and paused by a tall window that looked out over the palace gardens. Light filtered through the glass, painting patterns on the marble floor. He let his eyes rest on a row of ancient trees, their branches heavy with bright leaves. He could almost taste the crisp London air. In that moment, memories came rushing back from his time on the campaign trail. He remembered a small town in Iowa, a place with wide fields and quiet streets. He had stood on a makeshift stage in the town square, the sun low in the sky. A gentle wind had lifted the edge of his campaign sign. He greeted the crowd with a wave and began to speak about unity and opportunity. But his words had been for one woman in particular, an elderly farmer named Marge. She sat near the front, wearing a simple straw hat, her eyes fixed on him. After his speech, he had walked down into the crowd, shaking hands. When he reached her, she grasped his hand and held it tightly. Her voice had wavered as she whispered, "Thank you for giving my children a chance." He had knelt beside her, looked into her eyes, and promised to work every day for families like hers. That memory had stayed with him. Another memory came. From a bustling neighborhood in Chicago, he had stopped by a local school, and a group of third graders had lined up to meet him. Each held a crayon drawing of him standing beside the White House. One little girl had offered him her drawing, saying, "My picture shows you and me together." He had ruffled her hair gently and told her that her dreams mattered just as much as any adults. She had beamed with pride. He remembered the warmth in her smile, how it felt like sunshine in a chilly room. He thought about a dusty road in Kenya where he had once traveled. He had visited a small village, carrying letters from children who hoped he would read them. One letter, from a boy named Samuel, had described how seeing an African-American man as president had made him believe he could become anything: a doctor, as a teacher, even a president one day. Samuel had written that he would work hard for himself and for others. Obama had knelt to read the letter, his heart swelling with hope. He had promised Samuel that he would not let him down. All these memories felt alive as he stood in the palace corridor, wondered if the royal guard's grandmother had similar moments. Had she once watched her grandchildren play in the garden? Had she cooked meals in a warm kitchen, humming an old song? Had she sat by a window, thinking about rules and traditions and the world beyond her home? He thought about how those small moments added up over a lifetime, shaping who a person became. He felt a tug at his sleeve and turned to see the palace. Aide standing quietly beside him. She held a small note and an antique pen. Obama took the note and read it. The Queen would greet him shortly in her private study. He nodded and slipped the note into his pocket. He straightened his jacket and took a slow breath, letting himself carry the memories forward. He walked on, his footsteps soft on the carpet. The walls were lined with portraits of past leaders, each painted face holding a story, he imagined. Speaking to them, asking if they ever felt the same mix of doubt and determination. He imagined what they would say about hope and service and the weight of dreams. In his mind, he heard their silent voices cheering him on, reminding him that he was not alone. They reached a heavy wooden door. The aide opened it and let him inside. The room was warm and inviting, with tall bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Single globe sat on a stand in one corner. The center, the Queen's study, had a low, round table and 2 comfortable chairs. Large windows looked out onto a courtyard, where sunlight danced on stone. The Queen rose to greet him. She wore a simple yet elegant dress in soft pastel tones. Her hair was silver, and her smile was kind. They exchanged gentle greetings, and Obama felt at ease. They sat and spoke in quiet voices. He listened as she told him about her childhood visits to the countryside, her love for old books, and her belief in serving others. He thought of his own children and the stories they would someday tell about him. As they talked, he felt the royal guard's words echoing in his mind. He He remembered how that one sentence had opened a door to all these memories. He realized that leadership was like a bridge connecting thousands of small moments. Each handshake, each smile, each promise built that bridge. He thought of the people who had trusted him with their hopes and how he owed it to them to keep listening. After a while, the Queen excused herself to receive another guest. Obama remained in the study alone for a fleeting minute. He looked around at the books and the globe, imagining stories of explorers and thinkers who had shaped history. He felt a deep sense of connection to them and to all those whose names were not recorded. He thought of the guard's grandmother one more time, imagining her reading a newspaper at her kitchen table, learning about the world she helped shape with her vote. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard below. The royal guards stood tall, their red coats bright against the stone. He saw the same guard who had spoken to him. The bearskin hat made him look taller than the others. But when he spoke, he had sounded humble, just a grandson honoring his grandmother. Obama felt a quiet pride in that soldier's words. He turned and headed back through the corridor. The palace felt less like a museum and more like a living space where stories unfolded every day. He thought of the staff who polished the silver, who tended the gardens, who prepared tea and biscuits. Each had their own story, a family, a past, a set of memories that mattered. He resolved to listen to them whenever he could, to learn from their experiences, to honor their voices. As he walked, he thought about how to carry this lesson forward in his own life. He would write a letter to that guard's grandmother, asking the aide to deliver it. He would tell her how grateful he was for her trust and how her vote meant more than she might realize. He would share her story in his speeches and his writing, reminding others that leadership starts with a single act of faith. He passed through another doorway into a long gallery. The floor beneath his shoes felt cool, and the light from the windows shone on the polished surface. He looked at the portraits once more, smiling at the faces of kings and queens, diplomats, and soldiers. He thought about the moments that had shaped their lives, the victories and losses, the love and the loss. He felt honored to be part of that flow of history. At the end of the gallery, he stepped into a smaller room where the palace librarians worked. They were organizing documents and letters, carefully placing them in glass cases. A librarian looked up and gave him a respectful nod. Obama nodded back and walked slowly past the cases. He saw letters from famous visitors, notes from world leaders, and even a few personal diaries. He thought of his own papers and how future generations might read them. He hoped they would see his mistakes and successes alike and understand the heart behind his work. He paused by one display that held an old letter from a foreign leader, praising the Queen's kindness during a time of crisis. He thought of the power of words, how a letter, a vote, a simple sentence could change lives. He thought of the guard's grandmother once more, and how her vote had linked her story to his in a way he could never forget. He left the room and made his way to a small terrace overlooking the gardens. The late afternoon light turned everything golden. He stood and let the sun warm his face. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the breeze and the scent of roses. In that quiet moment, he felt the world wide and small, all at once the vastness of history and the intimacy of a single human connection. He opened his eyes and smiled to himself. He felt ready to continue his visit, to share stories, to learn more, and to carry these memories home. He knew that every person he met held a piece of history in their heart, and he knew that by listening and remembering, he could honor their stories and keep hope alive. With that thought, he walked back into the palace, eager for what would come next, carrying the guard's grandmother's faith with him wherever he went. ChatGPT said. Barack Obama paused at the threshold of a long marble hall, his shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. He had spent the last hour meeting with staff, listening to their stories of daily life at the palace. He had shared gentle laughter over a story about a gardener's favorite rose. He had nodded thoughtfully at a cook's humble tale of learning to bake shortbread from her grandmother. But inside him, the memory of the royal guard's words pulsed stronger than any ceremonial moment. He stepped forward and looked out through a narrow window that arched above a heavy wooden door. Beyond the glass, The courtyard lay quiet in the early evening light. The red uniforms of the guards glowed softly against the gray stones. Single guard, the same one who had spoken to him, stood motionless beneath a flag fluttering in the air breeze. For a moment, Obama felt the world contract around that solitary figure. He closed his eyes, and the weight of the day seemed to settle on his shoulders. He thought of every moment that had led him here, the long hours in the Oval Office, the victories and the defeats, the faces of families he had tried to help. And he thought of one small phrase: "My grandmother voted for you 3 times." It was a simple sentence, but it carried a lifetime of love and faith. In that moment, all the pomp of the palace and the rituals of state faded into the background. A gentle ache came over him, a mix of gratitude and sorrow, and he felt a single tear slip down his cheek. He did not hurry to wipe it away. Instead, he let it fall, a quiet salute to the grandmother he would likely never meet. He remembered his own grandparents, how they had shaped his values, how their stories of hardship and hope had guided him through public life. He felt connected in that silent hall, 2 families across the world who had placed their trust in him. His breathing caught for a second, and he stepped away from the window, moving toward a side alcove where a marble bust stood on a pedestal. He ran his fingers lightly along the cool stone, as if steadying himself. He pressed his lips together, determined to hold himself together, but his chest tightened with emotion. He closed his eyes and tilted his head upward, as though seeking strength from the dusty portraits lining the walls above. An aide approached quietly, pausing a few steps behind him. She had seen his hand brush his face, had noticed the glint of a tear. She offered him a gentle nod, giving him the space he needed. Obama appreciated her discretion. In his life under scrutiny, he rarely found moments so private. He let himself stand there for a few deeper breaths, feeling his heartbeat, slow and steady. He thought again of the grandmother. He imagined her sitting at a worn kitchen table, her hands folded over a folded ballot, her lips moving in a silent prayer for her family's future. He pictured her smile as she remembered his speeches, her pride as she told neighbors she had cast her vote for him once more. He felt the warmth of her belief, as if it were a soft blanket wrapping around his shoulders. Slowly, he straightened his posture and let his shoulders relax. He ran a thumb over the crease of his jacket sleeve, a small gesture of self-comfort. He reminded himself that emotion was not a weakness. It was proof of connection, proof of shared humanity. He drew a steady breath and opened his eyes. Standing in the alcove, he looked once more toward the hallway. The aides nearby continued their work arranging documents, coordinating schedules, preparing for the next part of his visit. The palace staff moved with quiet purpose, each person fulfilling a role in a centuries-old tradition. Yet for Obama, tradition had taken on new meaning that afternoon. It was not only about ceremony and history, it was about the personal stories. Woven into every corner of this place, he stepped back into the open hall and continued walking, his steps measured and calm. He passed under a vaulted ceiling, gilded and ornate, and saw his reflection in the dark glass of a portrait frame. His own face looked composed, but Obama knew the change within him. He felt lighter, as if the release of that single tear had lifted a burden he had carried quietly. A staff member stood by an arched doorway and offered a small cup of water. Obama accepted it gratefully, lifting his hand with a nod of thanks. He brought the cup to his lips and took a careful sip. The cool water soothed his throat and cleared his mind. He set the cup down gently and allowed a small smile. He felt ready to continue. He entered a smaller chamber where a group of palace advisors waited. They greeted him respectfully, bowing their heads slightly. Obama returned their greeting with a warm nod. He took a seat in a high-backed chair, facing a round table at the room's center. The advisors began to speak softly about forthcoming events and charitable projects. Obama listened intently, but his mind drifted briefly to the guard's grandmother once more. He realized how rare it was to be reminded so purely of why he had devoted himself to public service. In Washington, he had often spoken of hope in broad strokes: hope for a nation, hope for a world. Here under the palace's ancient roof, hope felt intimate. It felt like one woman's quiet act of voting, like one guard's simple confession, like one world leader's unguarded tear. The advisors finished their update, and one of them asked for his thoughts. Obama looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes with honest warmth, spoke clearly, offering suggestions and insights for the projects at hand. His tone was calm, his ideas grounded in empathy and experience. The advisors nodded in agreement, taking notes as he spoke. Again, the discussion drew to a close. Obama rose from his chair. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, thanked the advisors, and stepped back into the corridor. He paused again by another window, the last rays of the sun filtering through stained glass. He let the colored light play across his face, thought of the countless moments of connection he would carry with him from this visit. One final glance toward the courtyard revealed the guard still at attention, his silhouette sharp against the falling dusk. Obama raised a hand in a brief, informal wave. The guard's head turned slightly, and in that quiet gesture of acknowledgement, Obama found a profound sense of shared respect. No words were needed now. He turned away from the window and made his way toward the palace exit. As he walked, he straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket, restoring his composed appearance. Yet inside he carried a gentle glow, the warmth of a tear that had broken through his guard. He knew that when he returned home, he would share this story with friends and family, reminding them how small moments could hold the greatest power. At the great doors of Buckingham Palace, Obama paused one last time. He looked back at the halls, the chambers, the windows, and the stories they held. He tipped his head in a silent thank you and stepped through the threshold. Outside, his black SUV waited, its engine humming softly. He climbed in, offering a final wave to the staff standing nearby. As the vehicle rolled away down the palace drive, Obama looked out the window at the fading silhouette of the palace. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that leadership was as much about listening as speaking, as much about feeling as doing. A tear he had shed was not a moment of weakness. It was a moment of truth. And that truth would guide him in every step he took from that day forward. He rode back to his hotel in the black SUV, watching the lights of London pass by in soft blurs. His mind replayed the day's events, the palace halls, the Queen's study, and most of all the Royal Guard's simple words. He felt a gentle warmth in his chest that travel fatigue could not erase. He knew he would carry that warmth home with him. As the car turned onto a quieter street, he let himself smile. Thinking of the grandmother who had trusted him enough to vote 3 times, he felt grateful for that small, honest moment. Later that evening, Obama sat by a window in his room, the city lights twinkling below like distant stars. He called his wife, Michelle, and told her the story. His voice was soft as if he spoke into a sacred space. He described how the guard's words had felt as powerful as any speech he had ever given. Michelle listened, smiling at the depth of his emotion. He told her he wanted to write a letter to the grandmother, to thank her properly. She agreed it was a beautiful idea and suggested he use palace channels to send it. With pen in hand, he wrote slowly, choosing his words with care. He told the grandmother how honored he felt, and how her faith reminded him of the true heart of public service. He thanked her for giving him a precious gift, the reminder that every person he met had a story worth hearing. He asked the guard to deliver the letter with his heartfelt gratitude, sealed the envelope, and leaned back, imagining the grandmother holding his words close. He felt connected to her across time and distance in a way he had never expected. The next morning, Obama rose early and prepared for a speech at a local university. He decided to weave the palace story into his talk. On stage, he spoke of leadership, not as a title, but as an act of listening. He told the students about the Royal Guard and his grandmother's votes, describing how a single sentence had moved him to tears. He spoke of gratitude and humility, and how leaders grow when they draw strength from the people they serve. The audience sat in silence, then broke into warm applause. He stepped off the stage feeling that he had shared something true and lasting. In the days that followed, Obama visited community centers and schools across the city. Wherever he went, he looked for moments of honest connection. He listened to a teacher's story of helping refugee children learn English. He shook hands with a bus driver who shared memories of his own grandmother's wisdom. He asked questions of a nurse about the challenges of caring for the elderly. In each conversation, he remembered the guard's words and sought the small truths that often go unnoticed. He found that in sharing these truths, people felt seen and valued. Back home in Washington, he added the palace story to his memoir draft. He wrote a chapter called Moments of Grace, recounting the day in simple language that felt honest and raw. He described the palace corridors as though they were any other room in the world, filled with people's hopes and memories. Explained how service meant more than passing laws or signing documents. It meant honoring each person's story from the most powerful to the most humble. Writing those pages, he felt the same gentle warmth as he had under the palace's stained glass. He spoke about the importance of small acts in interviews and panels. He told journalists that when we listen, we learn. When we learn, we grow. He referred often to the royal guard's grandmother, saying that her quiet vote had carried weight far beyond a single ballot. He encouraged others to share their stories and to remember that every person they met might hold a piece of something greater. His message resonated, and soon people around the world began sharing their own guard stories on social media, celebrating simple acts of connection. At home one evening, he sat in his study with his own grandchildren, Sasha and Malia, who were staying over. They asked him about his trip, and he told them the story too. They listened with wide eyes as he described the palace guards and the grandmother. Sasha smiled and said she hoped people would keep telling their stories. Malia asked why one sentence could matter so much. Obama hugged them both and said, because words come from the heart, and the heart connects us all. They looked thoughtful, then scampered off to play, leaving him to his quiet pride. A few weeks later, he received a reply through palace channels. The guard's grandmother had written back on a delicate card with a watercolor of a rose garden. She thanked him for remembering her, and said her vote was her way of hoping for a kinder world. She wrote that she had shared his letter with her family, and they had smiled at the thought of meeting him one day. Obama held the card carefully, touched by the simple beauty of her words. He placed it on his desk, a reminder of the power of gratitude. As seasons changed, Obama continued to carry that memory with him. He remembered it in big meetings and quiet moments alike. On busy days in the office, he kept the grandmother's card in view, a small token of faith. When facing tough decisions, he thought of her and the guard, and he asked himself how each choice might affect real lives. He found that even in complex policy debates, the simplest truths guided him best: to listen well, to act kindly, to honor each person's voice. Years later, when he spoke at national events or community gatherings, he often began with that story. He recalled the palace courtyard, the red coats, the tall bearskin hats, and the guard's gentle confession. He saw listeners lean forward, imagining that moment. I saw hope light their faces. And he knew that by sharing one small story, he had helped others remember their own quiet moments of faith. He believed that stories like these could change the world, one heart at a time. In his quiet moments at home, he sometimes closed his eyes and pictured the guardian at attention, the palace flags, and the afternoon sun. He heard the echo of distant church bells and felt the patient strength of tradition meet the living warmth of personal connection. He understood that a life of service was built on these intersections between public and private, between ceremony and sincerity, between history and the human heart. He felt gratitude all over again for that day. So the story lived on. People who heard it told it to others. Leaders in other lands shared it at their own events. Writers quoted it in articles about empathy and service. A simple moment in a palace courtyard had become a timeless reminder that every life holds a story, that every vote is a voice, and that every act of kindness can shape the future. For Barack Obama, it remained one of the most powerful lessons of his life. He carried it with him forever, a gentle light guiding his journey. And he never stopped believing in the power of one small, heartfelt word.